In the vast, silent heart of the West, the truest measure of a man is not the weapon he carries, but the justice he serves and the loyalty he keeps. The sun over Red Rock Valley was a merciless furnace, baking the earth to the color of rust. In this harsh land, 9-year-old Lillian found her only sanctuary. It was not in the main house, where the presence of her father's new wife, Beatrice, felt like a winter chill. Her refuge was the stables, in the warm, quiet dark, with the scent of hay and horse. Here, the great black stallion, Tempest, would lower his head, his dark eyes seeming to understand the silent sorrows that a little girl could not put into words. He was her keeper of secrets, the silent witness to her tears. Near the stable door, a man sat on a low stool, mending a bridle with slow, deliberate movements. He was Black Hawk, a Dakota tracker Amos had hired for his skill with horses and his knowledge of the unforgiving land. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a steadying force. His gaze, dark and penetrating, would often rest on the girl and her horse. He saw the invisible bruises on Lillian's spirit, the fear she tried to hide behind a brave face. He understood the bond between them, a silent pact against the coldness that seeped from the ranch house. Lillian pressed her face into Tempest's powerful neck, her small hands clutching his coarse mane. "She says I am worthless, Tempest," the girl whispered, her voice trembling. "She says father should have left me at the orphanage, that I am just a wild thing, like this land." The great horse nickered softly, nudging her gently with his nose, as if to deny the cruel words. In the deep quiet of the stable, the only sound was the girl's muffled sobs and the steady rhythm of Black Hawk's awl punching through thick leather, a constant, reassuring beat in a world of uncertainty. From his place by the door, Black Hawk observed it all. He had watched this sad play unfold for months. The child's retreat, the stepmother's growing disdain, the father's willful blindness. He saw how Lillian only truly smiled when she was with the horse, or when she timidly brought him a cool cup of water from the well. He recognized the shadow in Beatrice's eyes whenever she looked at the girl, a venomous mix of jealousy and contempt. A storm was gathering over this homestead, and he feared the child would be at its heart. Beatrice stood at the window of the ranch house, her fine Boston silk dress looking absurdly out of place against the rough-hewn timber. She watched her stepdaughter in the yard, and her lip curled in a sneer. She despised this land, its dust, its heat, its untamed nature, but most of all, she loathed the girl's quiet friendship with that savage, the tracker, and her devotion to that wild beast of a horse. They were symbols of everything she wanted to tame or destroy. They represented the wildness she could not control, a constant affront to her sense of order. The moment came, as it always did, over a small, meaningless mistake. Lillian, her hands trembling under Beatrice's sharp gaze, accidentally tipped a pail, spilling a splash of precious milk onto the dusty kitchen floor. Beatrice's patience, thin as a spider's thread, snapped. "You are a clumsy, useless girl," she hissed, her voice low and sharp. She grabbed a willow switch that she kept by the hearth, her knuckles white. "This wildness must be beaten out of you, out of all of you." Her eyes, cold and hard as river stones, flickered toward the open doorway, looking out toward the stable. "This savage spirit must be broken," Beatrice declared, her voice filled with a chilling resolve. "And we will start with that beast you love so much. He will learn discipline, and you will watch. Perhaps then you and your Indian friend will understand what real order looks like." Her words were not just a threat of punishment. They were a declaration of war against the girl's spirit, aimed at the very heart of her world. A wave of terror, cold and sharp, washed over Lillian. It was a fear greater than any she had ever felt for herself. The thought of the switch falling on Tempest's glossy black coat was an agony she could not bear. She looked toward the stable, her eyes wide with a silent plea. Black Hawk, who had been checking the horseshoes on his own mount, had heard the raised voices. He straightened up slowly, his face an unreadable mask, but his eyes missed nothing of the child's panic or the woman's cruel intent. The threat against Tempest hung in the hot, still air, more menacing than a drawn weapon. Beatrice's face was a mask of cold fury as she grabbed Lillian's arm, her fingers digging into the child's soft flesh. She pulled the girl out of the kitchen and into the dusty, sun-bleached yard. In her other hand, she now held a long, thick bullwhip, a tool for breaking stubborn cattle, not for training a horse. It was an instrument of pain, chosen for that very purpose. Lillian stumbled, her bare feet kicking up clouds of red dust. Blackhawk was returning from the pasture, leading a mare, when he saw the scene. He stopped dead, every line of his body going rigid, his face, usually as serene as a calm lake, hardened into chiseled granite. He saw Beatrice dragging the crying child toward Tempest, who stood tethered to a post. He saw the whip in her hand. This was not discipline. This was a ritual of humiliation, a cruel performance meant to shatter the spirit of the girl by hurting the creature she loved. The world seemed to slow, each detail magnified. Beatrice raised the whip, the long leather tail uncoiling like a serpent. The sun glinted off the fine hairs on her arm. "You will learn your place," she snarled, her voice directed at both the horse and the terrified child. Lillian let out a small, choked cry, squeezing her eyes shut, unable to watch. Blackhawk took a step forward, his own instincts screaming at him to intervene, to stop this violation. But he knew that any sudden move from him, the Dakota man, could make things far worse in this tense, fragile world. The whip cut through the air with a vicious whistle, a sound that sliced through the afternoon quiet. It was aimed not at the child, but at the magnificent black stallion, who stood watching the woman with intelligent, wary eyes. For Blackhawk, time seemed to freeze in that single, terrible moment. The rising arc of the whip, the woman's twisted face, the child's silent terror. It was a perfect, ugly picture of cruelty, and he knew in his heart that whatever happened next would change everything on this ranch forever. Before the leather could strike flesh, Tempest acted. With a speed that was startling in such a large animal, the stallion reared slightly and swung his powerful head. The end of the whip, instead of biting into his flank, wrapped harmlessly around his thick neck. He stood there defiant, the whip hanging from him like a strange ornament. His dark eyes were fixed on Beatrice, no longer wary, but filled with a cold, challenging fire. The air crackled with a new and dangerous tension. He had refused to be a victim. Beatrice stumbled back a step, her face pale with a mixture of shock and outrage. An animal had defied her. "Gus!" she shrieked, her voice shrill with fury. "Gus, come out here now." She called for the senior ranch hand, a brutish man with a sour disposition and a deep-seated dislike for anything he could not understand, especially Blackhawk. "This savage has set his beast on me. He is trying to harm me." Her accusation, sharp and venomous, was meant to ignite the man's prejudice. Gus lumbered out of the barn, his face already set in a hostile scowl. He saw the whip around the horse's neck and Beatrice's frantic pointing. But before he could take more than a few steps, Blackhawk moved. He was no longer a passive observer. He flowed forward, silent as a shadow, placing himself directly between Beatrice and the little girl who was now clinging to Tempest's side. He did not touch anyone. He did not draw a weapon. He simply stood there, a solid, unmovable wall. His eyes, dark and cold as a mountain stream, met Beatrice's. "Enough," he said. The word was spoken softly, barely a whisper on the hot air, yet it carried the weight of a thunderclap. It was not a request, it was a command. For a moment, no one moved. There was only the sound of the wind whispering through the cottonwoods, the stamping of a horse's hoof, and the heavy breathing of the angry woman and the brutish man, both held at bay by the quiet, absolute authority of the Dakota tracker. The tense standoff was broken by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A lone rider approached the ranch. It was Marshal Colby, the law in this territory, a man whose weathered face told stories of long years and hard miles. His arrival was no accident. He had been alerted by Amelia, the new schoolteacher, who had been riding back to town from a visit to a neighboring homestead. She had heard the shouting and, sensing trouble, had immediately ridden to fetch the lawman, her heart pounding with concern for the little girl she taught. Marshal Colby took in the scene with a single sweeping glance. His eyes, sharp and discerning, saw it all. Beatrice, her face a mask of righteous fury. Gus, his hand hovering near the colt at his hip. Lillian, small and trembling, hiding behind the powerful form of the black stallion. And between them all, the still, imposing figure of the Dakota tracker. The tableau told a story, but Colby was wise enough to know that the loudest voice did not always speak the truth. "He attacked me, this savage and his wild animal!" Beatrice cried, rushing toward the marshal. "They are a danger to us all. You must do something, Marshal." Gus grunted in agreement, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "She speaks the truth, Marshal. I saw it. The man is trouble." But Colby's gaze had moved past them. He was looking at the faint older bruises on Lillian's arm, and at the way the child sought protection from the horse and the tracker, not from her own kin. Amelia had ridden up behind the marshal, her horse standing a respectful distance away. Her concerned gaze rested on Black Hawk, a silent message of support and trust passing between them. The marshal dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. He ignored the frantic accusations of Beatrice and Gus. Instead, his calm, steady eyes met Black Hawk's. Tempest stood his ground, watchful and alert, his intelligent gaze fixed on the lawman, as if he too were weighing the measure of this man who wore a star. Marshal Colby was a man who could read people better than most men could read a book. He gestured for Beatrice and Gus to step back, his authority quiet but absolute. He then walked slowly toward Black Hawk, his eyes never leaving the tracker's face. He stopped a few feet away, ignoring the simmering hostility from the ranch hand. "Son," he said, his voice calm and even, "tell me what happened here. Start from the beginning." His simple, direct address was a sign of respect that did not go unnoticed. From her position a short distance away, Amelia watched, her hands clasped tightly on her saddle horn. She saw the flicker of surprise in Black Hawk's eyes at the marshal's tone. He hesitated for only a moment, then spoke. His words were few, chosen with care, painting a clear, unvarnished picture of the morning's events. He did not speak of past cruelties, only of the spilled milk, the willow switch, and the whip intended for the horse. His voice was low and steady, carrying the simple weight of truth. While Black Hawk spoke, the marshal bent down and picked up the heavy bullwhip from the dust where it had fallen. He ran a thumb over the worn leather of the handle, feeling its familiar heft. He let the long tail of it trail on the ground. When the tracker had finished, Colby turned his cool gaze upon Beatrice, who was shifting nervously from foot to foot. Her mask of indignation was beginning to crack, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. The lawman's silence was more unnerving than any accusation. "Ma'am," the marshal said, his voice deceptively mild. He held up the whip. "This is a tool for thick-hided beasts, not for a stallion as fine as this one." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And looking at this handle, I would say this instrument has seen a great deal of work lately." He looked from the whip to the faint marks on Lillian's arms. "And I do not believe all of that work was done on cattle." Beatrice's face went pale as bleached bone. The truth was closing in around her. Gus saw the tide turning. He saw the doubt in the marshal's eyes and the fear on Beatrice's face. His simple worldview, where authority belonged to people like him, was being challenged. Anger and prejudice boiled up inside him. He took a threatening step toward Black Hawk, his expression turning ugly. "We do not need any of your kind telling us how to run our affairs, savage," he snarled. His hand drifted down, once again coming to rest on the handle of his holstered sidearm. His intent was clear. It was not a plan to shoot, but a raw display of intimidation, an attempt to reassert control through the threat of violence. "I will teach him some respect for white folks myself," he growled, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the worn wood of the handle. The air grew thick with unspoken danger. Amelia let out a small gasp, but before Gus's fingers could even begin to pull the weapon from its leather sheath, there was a blur of motion from the marshal. Colby's own Colt seemed to leap into his hand, not with anger, but with the fluid economy of a man who was one with his weapon. A single, deafening crack echoed through the valley, startling a flock of birds from a nearby cottonwood. A spark flew from the side of Gus's sidearm as the marshal's bullet struck it with perfect precision. The weapon was violently torn from the ranch hand's grasp and sent clattering into the thick dust, landing yards away. Gus stared at his stinging, empty hand in disbelief. "Next time, son," Marshal Colby said, his voice as cold and hard as the iron in his hand, "you should improve your aim. Or better yet, do not aim at all." The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. The marshal's eyes were like chips of ice. He gestured with his weapon toward Gus. You are under arrest for assault and threatening a man in my presence." The swift, decisive action left no room for argument. Justice in Red Rock Valley had just been delivered with a single, well-placed shot. In the sudden silence that followed the gunshot, Tempest made his own statement. As if sensing the shift in power, the black stallion reared up on his hind legs, his powerful form silhouetted against the harsh blue sky. He let out a piercing cry that was not of anger, but of triumph. His front hooves pawed the air before coming down with a thunderous thud, striking the ground just inches from where the stunned and terrified Gus stood. It was not an attack. It was a final, undeniable declaration of dominance. The message was clear to everyone present. This was a creature of immense power and spirit, not a dumb beast to be tormented. Gus scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet and falling into the dust, his face a mask of pure fear. Marshal Colby holstered his weapon and nodded to his deputy, who had just ridden up. "Take him into town." As the deputy hauled Gus to his feet, the marshal turned his attention back to Beatrice. His face was grim, his patience clearly at an end. "Ma'am," he said, and his tone left no room for negotiation. "Your presence here is no longer welcome. When your husband returns, I will speak with him myself. Until then, you will leave." He pointed toward the dusty track that led away from the ranch. "The stagecoach to the east passes at sunset. I expect you to be on it." Beatrice opened her mouth to protest, to argue, but the look in the marshal's eyes silenced her. She had lost. Completely. As Beatrice turned and stalked back toward the house, her shoulders stiff with defeated rage, Blackhawk's gaze met Amelia's. The schoolteacher's eyes were shining with relief and something else, a deep and profound respect. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. In that shared glance, a fragile connection was forged, a silent understanding that in this harsh and often unjust world, courage and decency still mattered. A quiet promise of a friendship, or perhaps something more, had just been made. Beatrice stormed into the ranch house, her mind a whirlwind of humiliation and fury. She was broken, but she was not yet defeated. As she began to throw her fine dresses into a trunk, a new, venomous thought took root in her mind. Revenge. A final act of cruelty that would strike at the very heart of her enemies. If she could not break the girl's spirit with a whip, she would shatter it with grief. Her eyes narrowed, and a cold, calculating look replaced her frantic anger. She knew just what to do. While Marshal Colby was outside, taking a statement from a shaken Lillian, with Amelia offering quiet comfort, Beatrice moved with stealthy purpose. She slipped out the back door and went not to the stable, but to the small, dark supply shed. There, on a high shelf, in a tin box marked with a skull, was a small packet of coyote poison, a fast-acting poison. Just a few grains, tasteless and odorless, mixed into the evening feed for Tempest. It would be a perfect, silent murder. She crept toward the stables, the small packet clutched in her hand. The yard was quiet. The marshal was occupied. Lillian and the schoolteacher were by the well. It was the perfect moment. But she had underestimated her adversary. Blackhawk, whose senses were honed by a lifetime in the wild, had felt a prickle of unease. He had seen the look on Beatrice's face as she entered the house. It was not the look of defeat, but of something far more dangerous. He had decided to watch. From the deep shadows of the barn, he saw her. He saw her slip toward Tempest's feed bucket. He saw the small, deadly packet in her hand. He moved with a silence that defied belief, his moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. Beatrice was so focused on her wicked task, her hand trembling as she opened the packet, that she never heard him. She never sensed the presence behind her until his hand closed firmly, but gently, around her wrist. The packet of poison fell from her numb fingers. Beatrice spun around with a terrified gasp, her face white with shock. She was caught. The scattered white powder on the ground was undeniable proof of her intent. Blackhawk held her wrist, his grip like iron, his face a mask of cold judgment. At that moment, Marshal Colby, his report finished, walked toward the stable. He took in the scene at a glance, the spilled poison, the terror on Beatrice's face, and the tracker's unyielding grip. "She tried to poison him," Lillian whispered, having followed the marshal. Just then, the sound of a tired horse brought all heads around. It was Amos, Lillian's father, returning early from a trip to town for supplies. He stopped short, his face shifting from weary satisfaction to utter confusion at the scene of chaos on his own ranch. The marshal, his deputy, a cowering Gus, his frantic wife, and his daughter standing beside the Dakota tracker. "In God's name, what has happened here?" Amos demanded, his voice rough with disbelief. Marshal Colby met the rancher's eyes. He spoke in low, serious tones, laying out the truth of the day's events without embellishment. He spoke of the whip, the threats, the drawn weapon, and finally, the poison scattered on the stable floor. With every word, the color drained from Amos's face. The veil of ignorance he had hidden behind for so long was torn away, revealing the ugly monster he had brought into his home and the suffering his daughter had endured in silence. As Marshal Colby put Beatrice in iron cuffs, her final, hateful screams echoing across the valley, Amos fell to his knees before his daughter. "Lillian, my girl, I am so sorry. I never saw," he choked out, his voice thick with shame. He then rose, walked to Black Hawk, and looked the tracker in the eye. "I am in your debt, a debt I can never repay." A fragile peace settled over Red Rock Valley, a peace bought not with a bullet, but with the loyalty of a horse and the courage of a man who dared to stand for what was right.